Hi, in this video I will talk about the paper Annotating High-Level Structures of Short Stories and Personal Anecdotes at the conference LREC 2018. My name is Boyang Li and I go by Albert. I'm currently a research scientist at the Liu Lishuo AI Lab in Silicon Valley. This is joint work with Beth Cartier, Tong Wang, and Florian Maz. Unfortunately, due to visa reasons, I cannot make it to this conference. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email at this email address shown on the slide. This paper is about narratives. Narratives are a fundamental form of human communication. We use narratives to persuade, to argue, to encourage, to elicit sympathy, and to convey messages. Therefore, a computational system that can understand human narratives will be able to communicate with humans more effectively. In recent years, there has been some renewed interest in creating computational systems and algorithms that understand narratives, and here I show only an incomplete list. However, very few of those papers actually focus on high-level structures of a narrative. Now, what do I really mean by high-level narrative structures? One of the most prominent example and the most well-known example is the five-stage pyramid structure commonly attributed to Freytag. The modern interpretation, however, differs from what Freytag wrote in 1863, but because of its wide adoption and wide influence, we still call this theory Freytag's theory. In this five-stage theory, a story begins with an exposition, which introduces the background and has the lowest tension. After that, some rising action happens that causes the tension in the story to rise, and the tension reaches the maximum at climax. In the falling action, the tension begins to fall and reaches another low point in denouement. We consider this to be a valid form of high-level narrative structures. There are also other computational formalism that captures structures of narratives, but we do not consider them to be high-level narrative structures. For example, another widely adopted representation is story intention graph. The story intention graph captures the events in the story as well as participants and the inferred intentions of those participants. In this paper, we consider this not to be a high-level narrative structure, but an event-level representation of the story. Similarly, we consider props functions for Russian folklore not a general form of high-level narrative structures because it is tied to a particular genre, the genre of Russian folklores. Leonard's plot unit is another influential formalism. Again, we consider that to be an event representation rather than a story structural representation. So now let me offer an operating definition for a high-level narrative structure. We require a high-level narrative structure to contain a small set of functions with typical orderance between them. This is in contrast to event-level representations because there are usually a large number of events, and the orderance in which you can tell those events can be numerous. A good definition for narrative structure should be independent of content and genre. This is in contrast to props functions that specializes to one genre of stories. We believe tension in the dramatic curve and how story progresses over time is important. So the narrative structure should capture how tension changes and how story progresses over time. The narrative structure should be relatively complete and provide enough coverage. it should describe, for example, 70 to 80% of the story rather than 10 or 20% of the story. So with that in mind, we have identified a few competing theories that all describe some form of high-level structure. Those theories have things in common, but also differ from one another. A narratologist who study the theories carefully may argue that these differences are very important, and I do not disagree with them. However, from an AI researcher's perspective, our goal is really to find an operational definition of an annotation schema and being able to use the annotation schema to annotate stories and use the annotation to create machine learning algorithms. Therefore, my goal in this paper is to ignore some of those details and try to identify the commonality between those theories, which help us create annotation schemas that we can use to annotate stories. In this paper, we annotate 360 stories. Most of them are short stories and personal anecdotes. And we also report the interreader agreement from the annotation. This may be the most complicated slide of the entire presentation, where I try to compare and contrast different narratological theories of narrative structures. And so we have already discussed free text theory. Todorov has proposed a very similar theory where the story begins with an old equilibrium. The equilibrium is later disrupted by some event, and people have recognized this disruption and made effort to repair this disruption. Finally, a new equilibrium is restored. By the use of the word equilibrium, we recognize that tension is at its minimum. Therefore, we align the old equilibrium with the exposition and the new equilibrium with the denouement. The disruption causes tension to rise, and therefore we align it with the rising action. The efforts to repair the disruption is aligned with the climax. Above and Walewski has a more complex theory where they consider not only the story itself, but also the interaction between the narrator and the audience. But for stories, they have 5 major categories, which we show here. The orientation introduces the background and the environment in which the story happens. Therefore, we align the orientation with the exposition. Labov and Walewski has an interesting term called the most reportable event. They argue that the entire story's purpose is to serve the MRE, which is, quote, the event that is less common than any other in the narrative and has the greatest effect upon the needs and desires of the participants in the narrative, end quote. We believe the climax is the most important and most dramatic event of the entire story, and therefore we align the most reportable event with the climax. In the resolution, the tension falls, so we align that with the falling action. Labov's definition for coda depends on its ability to resolve all further questions the audience may have. Quote, so that the question, what happens next, is no longer appropriate, end quote. So we align that with denouement in understanding that a new equilibrium has been established and dramatic tension is at its minimum. Jared Prince has a 3-stage theory where a story consists of a starting state, an ending state, and the transformational event that changes the starting state to the ending state. In 2015, Oyan and McKean tried to reconcile the two by arguing that the state-changing event is the most reportable. So here we follow their convention. By identifying the commonalities of those 4 theories, we have proposed another new set of annotation categories with slightly different terminology. In particular, we differentiate between the resolution and the minor resolution. The resolution resolves most, if not all, tension in the story. The minor resolution resolves a little bit of the tension, which is likely to rise again right after the minor resolution. We further require the aftermath to happen a while after the resolution to differentiate between the two categories. This slide shows the entirety of our annotation schema, which contains 10 different categories. We have already discussed 6 of them, including orientation, complicating actions, the most reportable event, minor resolution, resolution, and aftermath. That leaves us with 4, the abstract, return of MRE, evaluation, and direct comment to audience. I will discuss them one by one. The abstract is really just a summary before the story really starts. For example, before I tell you a story, I may say, let me tell you the most interesting encounter I ever had at this conference. And that is an abstract. The return of MRE is a rare category that causes the tension to rise after even the resolution, and is usually some kind of echo of the most reportable event. The evaluation is really the narrator's personal opinion about things in the story. It could be the moral, a lesson, or just some comment on what happened in the story. The direct comment is a different category that captures all other type of comments from the narrator to the audience. So, to further understand those annotation categories, we introduce the idea of a story frame. The story frame contains only the events that are part of the story. The abstract, the evaluation, and direct comments to audience are not part of the story frame because they describe the interaction between the narrator and the audience. Let me now show you some examples to illustrate the meaning of those annotation categories. Here we have a story that is pretty short, but does contain all the major categories like a long story. At the beginning, the narrator uses the abstract to summarize the story, a hedgehog saving the narrator's life. In the orientation, some background is being introduced. The narrator used to work nights and cycle home at 4 a.m. In the complicating action, tension starts to rise because a rare event has happened. While the narrator was cycling home, a hedgehog appeared in the middle of the road. In the MRE, the narrator narrowly escapes a fatal encounter with a truck around a bend. Finally, the narrator introduces the fate of the hedgehog. This reduces tension in the story. We classify this as a resolution instead of the aftermath because the event does not happen long after the MRE. Now let me discuss how we annotated the stories. We have collected in total 360 stories from 2 websites, Quora and Reddit. We annotated the story at the level of sentences. The annotators are not allowed to break up a sentence and apply 2 labels to different parts. We had 2 annotators who underwent 3 rounds of training, and we asked them to follow the following procedure. First, they have to read the entire story and decide on the most reportable event. After that, they're asked to determine the causal chain of event leading to the MRE and the resolution. Finally, we ask the annotators to decide on all other categories. They are encouraged to think in terms of events rather than the sentences that describe the events. We measure and report interpreter agreement. Cohen's kappa between the 2 annotators and 1 author who also annotated some stories are 0.39, 0.41, and 0.42 respectively. This indicates fair agreement. considering the fact that our annotators did not have formal education in linguistics or literature, and that this is a highly semantic task. We consider this to be a moderate success. We also performed some error analysis as shown in the confusion matrix on the right. We see that the three major categories, including orientation, complicating actions, and MRE, have relatively high agreement. The three categories that tend to appear at the end of the story, including resolution, aftermath, and evaluation, have some confusions among them. Rare categories like return of the MRE and minor resolution turn out to have low agreement. We believe the confusion in the annotations are concentrated on a few fine-grained categories, whereas the core stations of story progression were consistently identifiable. This also suggests that the errors can be further reduced if we remove a few non-essential rare categories. In conclusions, the high-level structures of a narrative are an important link for computer systems to understand the macrodynamics of narrative communication. To understand the high-level structures automatically, in this paper we propose a unifying annotation schema that borrows extensively from Labov and Letsky, which focus on the narrator-audience relation, and Freytag, which focuses on dramatic tension, as well as a number of other narratological theories. This is a more complete annotation schema than previous attempts that covers the entire story arc. You can download my dataset from my personal website, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at this email address. Thank you very much for your attention.